This morning I'm excited to have a guest speaker for you. One of my favorite things is to be able to bring people in to our church to expose us to new ideas, to new speakers, to outside influences. We've had some great people in the past, like Henry Blackaby or Tony Evans, but today I'm going to top all that. I'm building up here, okay? So don't disappoint me. Now, I'm really glad to have my brother here with us. Many of you, at least our long-termers, know Chris. He's been here a number of times in the past, but it's been 7 or 8 years since he was last here. So when he was last here, a number of times he's done some music for us. He's a brilliant musician, but he was just a kid with maybe a master's in biblical languages. But now he's a Cambridge-educated professor, and I thought, well, surely he can hobble together some kind of a sermon for us today. And so I've asked him to prepare something. But first, I want to actually ask Chris to come up. And we're just going to do a short interview to tell you a little bit about what he does. Why do we have people like him in the church? It's a different side of the church. Like we think about the church here. But in the global church, come on up, Chris, take a seat. In the global church, this is an important part of what we do, of having Bible colleges and those who spend a lot of time reading really thick, heavy books. His Christmas list is the most boring list ever. It's like all these really, like, who needs that many doorstops? But anyhow, so why do we need people like him? So I wanted him to come up here and I'm going to ask him a few questions so that you all can get a better understanding of what goes on in that global church, especially in the area of education and research. I mean, we've had the Bible for over 2,000 years. Well, not all of that for over 2,000, but for about 2,000 years or more now, and you would think we would have done enough research. So first of all, Chris, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You've got your master's in biblical languages, and then you went to Cambridge, where you got a PhD. And I was going to tell them what the PhD is in, but why don't you tell us what your expertise is?
Sure. So my PhD was looking at the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. It was a translation that was done around 250 BC, kind of in between 250 BC and 100 BC. So looking at the language of the Septuagint, this translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, and doing some linguistic analysis of the Greek, and then looking at the underlying Hebrew that it was translated from, and asking questions as to why the translators made the decisions that they did, looking at the Hebrew and looking at the resulting Greek.
Okay, so if you caught all that, we got the Septuagint. Was the Septuagint in use in Jesus' day?
Yes, it was. That was a yes or no question.
How was it in use?
Yeah, not as a doorstop. So the Septuagint, because it was produced in that time, 250 BC, 100 BC, by Hellenistic Jews. So that is Jews who were living in the diaspora, who grew up in and lived in the Greek Empire. They needed a Bible in their own language, and their language was Greek. And so this was the primary Bible for Jews in that period. And even for Jews who were still living in Israel at the time, many of them made use of the Septuagint. And so we even see the Septuagint specifically being quoted often in the New Testament, like in Paul's letters. We see places where it seems that Jesus is quoting from the Septuagint explicitly. So yeah, it was very much in use. It was very much a part of Jewish religion and thought. Yeah.
Okay, now you mentioned we've got the Old Testament was written in Hebrew mostly, originally, a little bit of Aramaic. Yep. New Testament was written in Greek.
Yes.
But now this is the Old Testament translated from Hebrew to Greek. So you work in both of those languages, Hebrew and Greek.
Yes.
How does that help us to better understand the Bible today, looking at the Septuagint?
Yeah.
If we have the Hebrew, I mean, we've got the Hebrew we can go to.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a few different things. One, the Septuagint, because it's a translation of Jews from the period of Jesus or just before Jesus, and because translation, anytime you do translation of a text, it necessarily entails interpretation. Like you can't just translate something and not interpret it. And so when we study the Septuagint, it gives us insight into Jewish thought from the period of Jesus' time. It helps us get a more robust picture of the religion that Jesus practiced, that Paul practiced, that they were all coming into, and that Christianity comes out of. Studying the Septuagint also gives us great confidence in the text of our Old Testament. So when it comes to the Old Testament, we don't have millions and millions of manuscripts. When it comes to the New Testament, we have tons and tons of manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament. But when it comes to the Old Testament, the evidence that we have, while it is very good, it is very sparse, at least in the original Hebrew. And so the Septuagint we're able to look at the Septuagint, which is this very, very old translation, and the texts of the Septuagint that we have are often even older. The actual, the age of the piece of paper, the papyrus or the codex, is often much older than many of our Hebrew texts of the Old Testament. So when we look at the Greek Septuagint, we can check our Hebrew Old Testament and say, oh yeah, these two things match. Sometimes you'll hear people spout off conspiracy theories about, the Bible was changed by these nefarious groups who had these nefarious purposes. But we can actually look at the text of the Septuagint and say, well, actually, no, it hasn't been changed. It remained the same for 1,000 years. And so that's very helpful. And then in places where there's still some question as to given this Hebrew manuscript and this Hebrew manuscript, maybe there was a hole in the manuscript and we're not entirely sure what it says. We have a few letters. The Septuagint helps us piece those places together to fill out, anytime that we do have a hole or illegible writing, what the original text said.
Okay, so that sounds important. But why do we need you to go study all this when we've got people in Israel, people in Greece that speak Hebrew and Greek?
Well, because the Hebrew and Greek spoken in Israel and Greece today is very, very different from the Hebrew and Greek that the Bible was written in. So we have 2,000 years of language change, language separation. And over that time, the vocabulary changes, the actual structure of the languages change. So just how the language works with verbs and subjects and the order that you put words in has changed drastically in both Greek and Hebrew over the 2,000 years. If you want a good example of this, just try picking up Chaucerian English and see how far you get. You won't get very far trying to read Chaucerian English. And Chaucerian English is only, it's even less than 1,000 years separated from the English that we speak today. And so when we look at the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, we're looking at an even larger distance between the languages.
Okay, now you also said earlier you apply something about linguistics when you're doing your work. What does that mean?
So there's a difference between studying a language and studying language. So studying a language is studying Greek or studying Hebrew or learning to speak a modern language. Studying language is to engage in linguistics, to ask questions about how humans communicate, how humans process information and then encode that information through words and sentences and intonation. And studying linguistics is to also look at all of the languages of the world that we have data of, and look at the patterns that emerge. And this is an amazing thing about language, because even though every language is different, there's a common denominator for every single language, and that's us, humans, the human brain, and the experience that we have in the world. And because of that, languages tend to develop and change and do things in similar ways. And so when we can look at all the languages in the world and the various language families in the world, and we can start to see patterns of, this is how this sort of thing tends to be communicated, or when two languages start interacting with each other, two language groups maybe move into the same space and start hanging out. This is how those languages tend to merge, which is very important when we look at Hebrew and Greek, as Hebrew was being influenced by Greek under the Greek Empire. We can then take that data, extrapolate from it, and then apply it to dead languages, ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew. Because the problem when studying ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew is that we don't have any native speakers of those languages that we can ask. Like we can look at, a sentence in the Old Testament or go read some Plato or something in Greek, and we can say, well, I think that's what that means, but it's a little bit weird. I've never seen this sentence before, or this is a really weird word or a really weird idiom. Well, with modern languages, we could just go ask somebody. You can go ask a Norwegian, wait, how do you say that in Norwegian? You can't do that with dead languages. And so we need all of this data, all of the data that we can marshal, so that we can responsibly ask questions and know how to frame those questions so that we can come to the right answers.
Okay, now I'm going to spring one on you because I didn't tell you I was going to ask this.
Okay.
But in response to that, can you give us like a real life example of something in the Bible, something in the Bible where we have an example that maybe if you read it in English, you take it one way, but once you've applied some linguistic analysis and looked at it in the original languages, you go, oh, what you thought this meant wasn't actually what it meant. I'm putting you on the spot, you can say no, but just to make it real for us that are reading the Bible in English or Norwegian or whatever our heart language is.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, some of those questions deal less with linguistic theory and more just, do we understand the language and understand its words? And so there are a lot of places where I will work with my students and say, well, you think the text says X, but that's just because it was badly translated. But it actually means Y. But no, here, two examples of what you're asking for. I had two, but now I'm forgetting one of them. I'll start with one example and then maybe move on to the second if I remember it, if it comes back to mind. So one thing we see often in language is that we as humans have a cognitive need to chunk information. That we, in order to process information well, we need to split that information up into manageable bite-sized portions. If you just have a wall of information like flooding over you, it's really hard to process it all. And so every language in the world has various ways of signaling little chunks of information. And this can be anything from using full stops at the end of sentences to using paragraphs in language, using paragraphs when you're typing or writing something that, a paragraph is kind of a distinct unit. And if you had like 5 paragraphs that were all one big, ginormous paragraph, that'd be a little bit overbearing. But languages do this in different ways, depending on just the inventory available to the language speaker, and also just depending on how people would communicate. So I mentioned paragraphs. We use paragraphs in our writing to signal discrete information units. Well, in ancient Greek, they didn't have paragraphs. Ancient Hebrew, they didn't have paragraphs. And actually in Greek, this is a really annoying thing about ancient Greek. If you pick up an ancient Greek manuscript and you start reading Greek, the first thing you're going to notice is that there are no spaces between the words. So not only do they not have paragraphs, they don't have spaces either. It's just a wall of letters. So one thing that the Greeks would use in order to tell you, okay, we're moving on from point A to point B, or now we're kind of moving on to something completely different, is through various particles in the language, small words, like how we have words like then or now or even and or but. Greek has some very specific words that don't quite have meaning in the way that we think of meaning, like, oh, that's an and, or that's a but, or that's a for, F-O-R, not F-O-U-R, but rather their meaning is, I am signaling a new chunk of information. And that's really helpful once we start to understand that. And the problem is, we didn't start to understand this about Greek until probably the last you can see some people understanding it at the turn of the 20th century, but nobody paid attention to them. And it really wasn't until the past 20 years or so that we started using insights from linguistic investigations into human cognition and human processing that we then started connecting these dots of, oh, that word that we often just translate as but in Greek doesn't actually mean but. That's why there's a lot of times we don't translate it as but we've never asked that question. Why do we sometimes not translate this as but? It's because it doesn't mean but. It means new information unit. And that has a really big effect on how you read a text. Because if the Apostle Paul is using these little words to say, I'm moving on from point A to point B, now I'm moving on to point C, oh, now I'm going to go back to point A, and he's just using these little words to signal this, and we weren't picking up on that, well, that means we're not following the structure of Paul's argument the way that he wanted us to, the way that he intended his readers to. And so when we start bringing in these insights from linguistic theory, we start to see, okay, this is how Paul's argument is structured, or this is how Matthew is structuring his gospel from kind of story unit to story unit. And sometimes they don't quite match up to how we used to think they matched up. Yeah.
So the last question, does that mean that we'll see some new translations in the future that'll change how we read the New Testament? Old Testament?
Yes, and we've already seen a lot of work done in translations, just even over the past 20 years, that have been incorporating a lot of this insight. And so the one issue when it comes to Bible translations is that they're a lot of work, and they take a lot of time, and in order to do a Bible translation, you need a team of people, and people have to agree, and they often don't. So actually, I have friends who are on the ESV translation committee, and I have friends on the NIV translation committee, and talking to them about the discussions that are had when trying to make decisions about, do we translate something this way or this way, it takes a lot of time. It takes years and years and years, but it's important work, and so we are seeing people incorporate this, but it takes time, it trickles down, and but I think we already see some good translations that are making good use of it, that are available now.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing all that with us. We're gonna get the pulpit out, and I'm gonna read Ephesians 2, which will be the text for today, but I appreciate Chris sharing with us one of the ways that it's been described before. This is the relationship between those doing research and professors and what we do in the local church. Is that in the local church, it's kind of like what I do, what other Bible teachers here do, is we're passing out water bottles so you have something clean to drink, right? Spiritual food, spiritual water. You can go with the metaphor here. Those that are looking at the original text and making sure it's translated correctly, they're like the people that are back at the factory or at the spring who are making sure that the water being put in those bottles is as clean as possible. So Chris is there to try to protect and make sure, hey, is what's getting out to those people that are practitioners who are reading text, reading commentaries, and trying to teach this, getting accurate information, because all we have to go on is what the best researchers and scholars tell us. And so that's a lot of what his role is.